Hello, good afternoon. This is Brian Daitzman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of The Intellectualist, and this is History of the Present. History of the Present is a public affairs series produced by The Intellectualists, along with Lincoln Square. In this show, we're trying to talk about the major forces that are reshaping this era, particularly as it relates to AI, climate change, inequality, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the new space race. Today, I'm joined by John Harwood, one of the most experienced political journalists in American media history. John has covered American politics from inside nearly every form of modern journalism: newspapers, legacy reporting, national TV, cable news, digital media. He has reported for Wall Street Journal, contributed to the New York Times, and served as CNBC's chief Washington correspondent and covered the White House for CNN. Speaking with John today, he's going to give us a very rare vantage point of where we are in terms of history of the present. John, I want to begin with the big picture with you today. How are you doing today, by the way?
Doing great.
That's great.
As good as we can be with the country in the condition it's in right now.
Well, I think that's a very fair answer, John. I want to start very simple. Right now, what is your biggest concern for American democracy, given your experience as a journalist and given your many decades of experience reporting on U.S. democracy? John, what is your concerns right now about American democracy?
Well, my biggest concerns are, one, the sledgehammer that Trump has taken to the rule of law in this country. Number two, the way he has trashed the United States government and disabled it in certain respects, installed incompetent people at the head of major agencies. And then I'm also concerned about his attempt to manipulate election results and sow distrust in election results that have been trustworthy. And in pursuit of his effort to interfere, he's been claiming that trustworthy election results are not trustworthy. And that's false. It's a lie. And that's a major concern because at the end of the day, valid elections and confidence in elections is essential for our democracy.
John, you've been covering American politics throughout your entire career. When you saw the president gaining prominence, particularly in the 2015 era, 2016, did you believe, given your experience, your historical knowledge, did you believe that this would get to this point where in 2026, it's now June 2026, we have a twice impeached president who's a felon, who's been civilly adjudicated a sex abuser and tied to Jeffrey Epstein? Did you ever believe in American history that we would have an American president of this stature and in that time period, particularly around 2016, did you ever think it would get to this?
Absolutely not. And I suppose that's a failure of imagination on my part. I thought Trump was a clownish figure who was not a serious candidate for the Republican nomination. I was certainly mindful over the preceding number of years of the growing white-hot intensity of the Republican base, but perhaps because it had happened that way all the elections that I'd covered, I assumed that a more solid, substantial figure would ultimately emerge to claim the Republican nomination. I did not expect it to be Trump. It was. He had a presidency that was very bad, very unsuccessful the first time, and then culminating in the January 6th insurrection. I thought he was so discredited by that, in addition to what had happened previously on COVID, there was no chance he was going to come back. Again, failure of imagination on my part. And as it happens, I believe the unique circumstances of Joe Biden's term, with principally the inflation that was a worldwide phenomenon, maybe made somewhat worse by Biden, that had such a large political effect on the country that it enabled Trump to win. There were, of course, other factors, Biden's age, but I think inflation was the principal driver. And now we're in a situation where Trump is completely dominant within the Republican Party, so he gets almost no constraint from Republicans in Congress. He has a Supreme Court that is predisposed to support what he wants to do. And as a result, we have an unrestrained president doing a lot of dangerous things. And I never would have anticipated that was the case.
John, what do you think happened to the Republican Party? You've been reporting for a while. The Republican Party has always had sort of figures like Newt Gingrich, sort of the classic Southern demagogue who really appeals to the lowest common denominator, frankly, of American voter. And when I say that, I mean racism, which is our national poison. What do you think happened to what happened to the GOP?
Well, I think with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which triggered a massive migration of white conservatives in the South to the Republican Party, Republicans welcomed that because they had been trying to counter what looked like a national Democratic majority since Franklin Roosevelt. The influx of those white conservative voters helped make the Republican Party the national majority, the presumptive favorite in presidential elections. And in the end, the sentiments of the people who came within the party came to overwhelm whatever philosophical lodestones had guided the party before. And, at the same time, as white conservatives moved to the Republican Party, more educated voters, more affluent voters moved to the Democratic Party. It created a big stratification by education between the parties. And as the country grew more diverse, there was a huge stratification by race, so that African American voters, ever since Barry Goldwater in 1964 opposed the Civil Rights Act, en masse voted for Democratic presidential candidates. As late as 1960, Richard Nixon had gotten a third of the black vote. Well, it plummeted way down to 10% or below after that. So you had a white core and an increasingly blue collar constituency within the Republican Party, a more affluent but also minority influenced coalition in the Democratic Party. And I think in the last 20 years or so, as we've gotten closer and closer to when America would become majority minority,
Yeah.
and Barack Obama, the first black president, sort of symbolized the demographic change the country was experiencing, that created a kind of panic among that within that white working class base that led to the embrace of a figure like Donald Trump. In addition to those two things I mentioned, we've seen the country's become more secular, and so conservative Christians have come to see their world being rocked by that trend. We've had the digital revolution, which has reduced the premium for physical labor. And so a lot of men who could earn substantial livings without a great deal of education suddenly found themselves not only in competition with women, because women were increasingly freed to enter the labor force by social change in the United States, but also the technology, the manufacturing machinery became such that, again, the premium on physical strength declined. So there were a number of things which created a kind of panic of we're losing our country. And I think that is the core of the MAGA movement.
What do you think is, some of your you start making some really interesting historical pinpoints, talking about civil rights era and how the Republican Party changed, particularly with the Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
And what do you think it was the effect of Fox News? And I don't mean just Fox News, but Fox News obviously is particularly bad. What do you think that had to do on the media environment, or actually, let me put a finer point on that: the information environment of the United States, particularly as we started going into the internet era? We started seeing Facebook, start seeing Twitter, we start seeing what happened to the common square, where Americans could get a CBS News you could watch, let's say in the 90s, or NBC News, and get a general understanding of what's going on in the world. You might not agree with CBS News, you might not agree with Dan Rather, right? But you got a genuine sense of what was going on in the world. What happens when you live in a country of 350 million people where no one knows what's happening?
it's gotten shattered into a million pieces. I think of the contrast with the world that my father came into journalism with. He was a World War II veteran, Iwo Jima Marine, came out, went to work for newspapers in Nashville and then Louisville, and finally came to Washington for the Washington Post. And at that time, you had newspapers, if they had good ownership, people who cared about the news business, they were making a lot of money because they essentially had monopolies within their markets. And they were willing to invest in good journalism. The same was true of major TV networks. You had, not many choices on the television. So you had ABC, CBS, and NBC. And you had a couple of news magazines, Time and Newsweek. And that was sort of the media establishment, if you will. And that the penetration of audience that those news organizations achieved created kind of a baseline consensus, not that everybody agreed, but a shared set of facts.
A shared reality. There was a shared reality.
Yeah. Right. And so, the changes since then, you mentioned Fox, and I think Fox has been a pernicious force in our country. It's hard to separate out the effect of Fox independent of what else has happened. And what else has happened is the internet, the technology, the digital revolution. And that has completely democratized the world of political commentary. Social media has done that as well. So the power and influence of people like my dad in his day, or me, 20 years ago, by virtue of the platforms that we worked on, has just been dramatically diminished. Audiences are down. Television viewership is down. People are streaming on their phones. I have 3 daughters. None of them would even consider getting cable television. They don't watch that stuff. They get their news other ways. And so it's made a very difficult information environment for governance, for candidates to seek votes. It's a much more chaotic system, and I think that the very chaos that it engenders exacerbates some of the other tensions within the country, and left us in kind of a mess, informationally and politically.
John, some very recent reporting we've been seeing this last week or last 2 weeks regards 60 Minutes. And 60 Minutes is obviously a very well-known show with a great reputation for journalism. My understanding is that Scott Paley, who is obviously a very renowned journalist, he said that the management at 60 Minutes is now murdering the show. I think that's the term he used. Would you agree with that?
It's hard to argue with it. I mean, they have fired the executive producer, replaced that person with somebody who is not of comparable experience and expertise. They, according to Scott Pelley, they tried to influence his reporting on protests over immigration actions in Minnesota.
Which is absolutely beyond the pale.
Right. According to Sharon Alfonsi, who is a 60 Minutes correspondent whose contract is now expired. She's not there anymore. They withheld a story that she had prepared for air because they didn't like the way that it portrayed the immigration policy of the administration and some of the consequences of that. And I think it's kind of obvious that changes that have been underway at CBS News have been driven and influenced by the desire of the ownership, ownership group to please Donald Trump for regulatory favor. And I think that is something that I never would have dreamed would have happened, but I think it's happening. And I expect it to happen once the merger goes through and they acquire CNN as well. And even before that, CNN itself was trying to placate Trump. They took me off the air for that reason because I've been quite critical for Trump. of Trump for a long time. So the idea of news organizations acting to bend the knee toward a president who is wielding regulatory power over them uh, is not a good thing for the country, and it's not something that we've seen anywhere near this scale before.
Some have suggested, there was this history in Russia. It's very recent, where President Vladimir Putin, he, in essence, there's been reporting suggesting that President Donald Trump sees a roadmap, particularly from President Vladimir Putin, president of Russian Federation, and the former Prime Minister of Hungary, and in essence, Viktor Orban, in essence, seeing this merging of state money and journalism. Why is that so particularly dangerous, John?
Well, you want to have a society where you have a government that answers to the people, and a press that helps hold the government accountable so the people can make informed decisions. Donald Trump admires power and dominance, and he admires leaders who can exercise power and dominance. Vladimir Putin is one of those people. Viktor Orban is one of those people. Xi Jinping in China is one of those people. Vladimir Putin also happens to be somebody who is from a country that has put a lot of money into Donald Trump's businesses over the years. There's mutual back scratching. Putin helped Trump in the 2016 election, no matter how many million times you hear Donald Trump say the whole thing was a hoax. And Donald Trump has never, ever distanced himself from Vladimir Putin, an historic adversary of the United States, and in fact has taken the word of Vladimir Putin's government over our own government, over our own intelligence services. And so it creates a posture in which he's weakening the country that emerged from World War II as the dominant superpower in the country, weakening our alliances with other industrial democracies. So it is not a good situation for the country. And what he's doing with the press is part of that.
Jen, why do you think, and again, maybe, and this is maybe some speculation on your part, but why do you think the current president of the United States, for instance, prefers a Viktor Orban or a Vladimir Putin or a Kim Jong-un over our traditional, let's say, allies? For instance, the president has a historically poor relationship with Canada, for instance. The president has a historically poor relationship with NATO and the European Union. Can you maybe speak to some of that and how it appears for someone who really does understand the history of the present in terms of just your reporting? How odd is this for an American president?
It's stunning. We haven't seen this before. You know, the set of alliances that emerged after World War II have safeguarded liberty and prosperity in free countries around the world ever since. And Donald Trump, you know, as I mentioned a minute ago, values people who can exercise untrammeled power because he wants to do that. His ego requires him to be untrammeled in the exercise of his power. Part of that is it's easier to punch your allies than to punch your adversaries. I think he's scared of Vladimir Putin. I think he's scared of Xi Jinping. He doesn't feel the same way about Canada or Greenland or Denmark. And so he tries to throw his weight around to look tough and strong by making these ridiculous statements about Canada becoming the 51st state or Greenland becoming part of the United States. It's all absurd. Makes no sense politically or in terms of geopolitics, global strategy. But it's all a reflection of the disfigured personality that he has. He's a narcissist. I think you would say he's a malignant narcissist. He's somebody who does not possess empathy for other people. And so he's just breaking stuff for the purpose of being able to break it. And it's not good.
So, we talk about profiles of courage in American high schools where kids, they learn about Americans who've actually shown courage,
Mhm.
right? And there are a lot of examples, particularly people who sacrifice in the armed forces. What's going to happen to someone like a Senator Lindsey Graham in history, someone who presented themselves as a very serious actor, who was known to go to NATO lecture allies, particularly about spending, being against Russia. And now it seems that with President Donald Trump in office, all of his stated values, particularly the values he stated when he was very close, publicly close with the late Senator John McCain, do not appear to have much depth to them. How do you think history will see people like a Lindsey Graham or people similar to him?
I think people will see Lindsey Graham as a sad figure who ultimately showed that he doesn't have any principles that count, that uh, his principal interest is holding on to some kind of influence. I remember interviewing Lindsey Graham in 2016, where he said, if we nominate Donald Trump, it's going to destroy the Republican Party and we'll deserve it. And I think at that moment, he, like me, didn't expect Donald Trump to win the nomination and win the presidency. Once that happened, Lindsey Graham then turned around and became an ally of Donald Trump. After January 6th, when you had a president of the United States inspiring a violent insurrection that cost American lives, that challenged the fundamental choice that voters were making in our democracy. And he went on the Senate floor and he said, I'm out. I've had a good relationship with Trump. I'm out.
Right.
Well, when Trump won election again, he's completely turned around, and now he just tweeted this afternoon, I'll do whatever I can to help him, whatever it is. And it's a disgraceful picture, actually, and it doesn't serve the interest of the United States.
Um, John, and I imagine you have interviewed or been able to interview former House speakers.
Mhm.
What is your take on the man Mike Johnson, Speaker Mike Johnson? He's known as MAGA Mike. He is someone who has a known reputation for being very solicitous to President Donald Trump, even as the president is engaging in acts that many people describe as unconstitutional and dangerous. John, we were just talking about Lindsey Graham. Let's talk about Mike Johnson. He's a constitutional officer. How do you think history will judge him as the man, as the House Speaker who let these things happen?
As a weakling, he has no independent stature. He has no independent freedom of movement. Donald Trump has joked in his presence about, I have two jobs. I'm the president and I'm the speaker too. Um, Somebody with self-respect would be humiliated by that.
Yeah.
But Mike Johnson does not seem to have enough self-respect to do that. He, again, like Lindsey Graham, he's simply trying to hold on by the fingernails to having some power with this very narrow House majority. He's not doing anything constructive with it. Again, it's a very sad state that Congress has fallen into, given Republican leadership.
How do you think people will judge us in 25 years and 30 years, assuming things get better? I don't know if things will get better, but let's say things do improve.
um, you know, there will be a whole lot of different judgments of a whole lot of different people. You know, there are a lot of members of the press, and some have distinguished themselves, and I think some have not. It's not always easy to tell the difference between them. And you know, I do think collectively the major press organizations have continued to report aggressively, even while ownership is concerned, or maybe trying to pull back the reins a little bit in some cases. Washington Post, for example, there's still a lot of really good journalists at the Washington Post, which is where my father spent most of his career, who are doing good work. New York Times is doing great work. So there'll be different judgments of different people. I think all of us in the end have to look in the mirror and judge ourselves, and be confident that we have been able to perceive the truth, and have been able to share that with our audiences. And people perceive the truth differently, and people have value different things about American society. But I think the ones that I was brought up to value, which is the United States as a bulwark for freedom, for capitalism, for tolerance within the United States. We've had a long struggle to expand rights and dignity of people who didn't have it before. And it's been slow and uneven and ugly at times, but progress has continued, and Donald Trump is trying to roll some of that back.
Let's talk about the candidates today. There was a movie that came out not too long ago, and forgive me, I'm forgetting the candidate's name, but he was a Democratic candidate, and he was having an extramarital relationship. I believe this is the 1988 candidate for the Democratic nomination.
You're probably talking about Gary Hart.
Gary Hart, yes. Thank you very much, John. And Gary Hart, he got a lot of coverage because he was engaged in an extramarital relationship with a woman who was obviously not his wife, right? Mm-hmm. Let's now go. That was in, let's say, 87, 88. We're now in 2026. In the state of Maine, there is a candidate, a gentleman named Graham Plattner. And there has been a lot of reporting on Mr. Plattner. Some of it's not very flattering. And my question is to you, John, is in the era of Trump, does character, or maybe more so than that, does this sort of background really even matter, if really what matters most to a lot of people is just winning?
It matters less than it did. The public has become accustomed to a much wider range of behavior and tolerant of it. There was a time not all that long ago where interracial dating and marriage was disapproved by a majority of the American people. Right. It wasn't legal in some places. People disapproved of people who are gay, and attitudes, and people said people who are gay could not marry one another. So there's been a whole lot of change in the mores and values of the United States, and even outside those realms of change. Just in the sexual revolution changed the way people felt about sex among people who were not married. So there are a whole lot of changes that have taken place, and as they've taken place, the American public, in part because of reporting by the press, has become more and more aware of behavior that might once earn condemnation for politicians. So I think there's less condemnation than there would have been in the past. Gary Hart was operating in a different political universe. Yeah. But I also think that this specific moment, apart from that general trend, where Donald Trump is posing a serious threat to what makes America exceptional, makes some of the flaws of some of the people running to stop him seem less important. And I think that's the case with Graham Plattner. I do not approve of extramarital. I don't approve of marital infidelity. I don't approve of people who are abusive toward people they're in relationships with. I don't approve of Nazi tattoos. I don't know what all of those things mean. I'm not sure what they add up to about Graham Plattner, but whatever they add up to me, is less important than the existential threat to the country that we're under right now.
John, can we talk about that bargain right mm-hmm. there? Because I think a lot of people are willing to make that bargain. And I think if we're going to be honest, what is, there's always this discussion about the lesser of two evils, mm-hmm. right? Well, if it's evil, but if something's less evil, it's not as evil, right? And so I guess we don't live in a perfect world, I guess, is the point I'm trying to make. And people have to make really hard choices against two options. And given one option is possible dictatorship, or another is a maybe, I don't know, politician with a background that maybe he could do more in explaining and possibly bringing people to his side and explaining, I think people are willing to roll the dice. What do you think about that?
Well, certainly the polls would tell you that's the case. Graham Plattner's numbers so far have not suffered from the news stories that have come out. He was running against a twice elected governor of Maine in the Democratic primary, who Democratic leaders thought was the strongest candidate, and he raced past her. I think it's important to say that Graham Plattner isn't just the negatives that he has. He also has some positives. He has a different affect, a different personality. He's speaking up for working class voters in ways that many Democrats find refreshing. And so it's not all a race about evil. I mean, Susan Collins is not evil either, for that matter. She's a politician who, by her acquiescence, is enabling Donald Trump to do things that are bad for the country. But I think people are going to have to judge in Maine. What is more important? Keeping the flaws of Graham Plattner out of the United States Senate, one of 100 seats, or sending someone to the Senate who is likely to join with other members of the Democratic Party and stopping or curbing the damage that Trump's doing to the country. I think that's the choice that Maine voters are going to be left with. Of course, we haven't had the primary yet. Janet Mills is still on the ballot. There's absolutely no reason at this point to think that Graham Plattner is dropping out or can be defeated in that primary. So the odds that he will not end up being the Democratic nominee are very, very small.
And there's a very good chance, given the sentiment of the country, he could quite possibly become a U.S. senator. Why do you think candidates like Plattner, not focusing on the negatives, but let's focus on what he's saying, all right? And let's talk about why it is connecting with voters. Plattner is saying the rich are too greedy right now. What about health insurance? What about energy prices? Those are very simple things to connect with people. Why do you think Democratic leadership is maybe averse to Plattner and maybe these sort of new political figures that are arising in sort of this aftermath of 2016 Bernie Sanders? And you're really starting to see changes in competition within the Democratic Party elites, particularly with the mayor of New York City, Mayor Mamdani, who has been very successful, I think, in managing all these changes as the party changes. Why do you think a Graham Plattner is particularly electable in this 2026 election?
The electorate in the United States is not happy right now. They're not happy with the economy. The economy is not terrible. And it was not terrible under Joe Biden, but people felt that it was terrible. So you have an electorate in a bad mood. They want somebody who's an outsider, has not been seen as part of the system. Democratic leaders in Washington thought Susan Collins is hard to beat. We have a proven phenomenon in Janet Mills. She's been elected statewide governor. Graham Plattner has not. So she was the safe choice. Well, voters in Maine were not looking for safe. Democratic voters were not. So I think freshness, all flaws are not negative. Some are badly negative, but not all of them are. And somebody who looks more real, more authentic, appeals to a lot of people. And especially when he is catching the vibe that Donald Trump caught to some degree, telling people you're being screwed by this economy and I'm going to help you. They come at it from different angles, but it's the same message of hostility toward the powers that be. Donald Trump was expressing that. Graham Plattner is expressing that. And there are voters that Graham Plattner is going to try to get in the Maine Senate elections who voted for Donald Trump. And we're going to see if he can sustain the success he's shown so far in doing that. General election polls show that he has led Susan Collins. We got months to go before the election, though.
John, what do you think the conflict in Iran? President Donald Trump began attacking Iran without any congressional debate, without telling the American people. What has that conflict done to his presidency?
It's hurt it very badly. And it's hurt the United States. It's humiliated the United States because Donald Trump had this idea, fostered in part by the quick takeout of the Venezuelan president And the notion that in 48 hours he could change the leadership of the country, look strong, look dominant in the way that we talked about a few minutes ago, and do something that other presidents, Reagan, first Bush, Clinton, second Bush, Obama, Biden, were all not willing to do, which is risk a war with Iran. Donald Trump said, in his narcissism, said, I can do it. It'll make me look good, and let's go, with a push from Bibi Netanyahu. And what we've discovered is that he has strengthened the hardline government within Iran. He has not been able to prevent Iran from closing the Straits of Hormuz. In fact, showing Iran that they can get a chokehold on the global economy in ways that they had never exercised before. And so you have Trump now sort of begging for an exit, a way out of this war, which is meandering along with ceasefire and then attacks. And meanwhile, gas prices are going up. It's expanded uncertainty around the economy. Yes, the stock market has done extremely well, but the ordinary American voter is not feeling good about it. And that's why Donald Trump's trying to get out.
There is now reporting that the president is considering doing a military action with Cuba. What is going on? Why? So the president of the United States, when he was running against Vice President Kamala Harris during the 2024 race, he paraphrasing, that he was going to be the no new wars president, no new forever wars, right? But the president has launched a number of wars that don't seem like they can end anytime soon. Do you think that discrepancy, do you think that has hurt him the most with his voters?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think it has hurt him. There are a number of things that have hurt him. The fact that he's been more attuned to graft and corruption, grabbing money for himself than the problems of the American people. The fact that his tariffs drove up prices and hurt the economy. The fact that he tried to cover up the Epstein files to spare himself and his friends embarrassment. All of those things have produced political consequences for him. And this is just one more thing. And it's produced a very sharp and noticeable rise in gas prices. And, Trump used to make hay over how gas prices were under Joe Biden. This is something that Trump has directly caused by his action in Iran. And people are making that connection. And that has not been to his benefit.
What do you think is the story for 2026, for the 2026 midterms? What do you think is the story for candidates? If you're a Republican candidate, are you running towards the president? You're running away from the president? How do you do that? If you're a Republican lawmaker who, for the last 10 years, who has been very solicitous, very supportive, and really supportive in ways that almost frankly embarrassing. We were just talking about Speaker Mike Johnson and Senator Lindsey Graham. If you're a Republican running in 2026 midterms, where are you running?
They're going to try to get some distance from Trump as much as they can get away with. But the problem is they can't get away with very much. Trump has proven that however weak he is in the country overall, he remains very strong within the Republican Party. He can end people's careers, and they all know that. So they have to try to figure out a tolerable way to express the fact that they're not all in with everything Trump is doing. And you've seen, for example, after there was a poll last week that showed Sherrod Brown, the Democrat, trying to regain a Senate seat against John Husted, the Republican incumbent, was ahead by 8 points in a very conservative, what is now a very conservative red state. Immediately, you saw Husted trying to cast votes differently to try to show people he was not towing the Trump line. I think people will do that, but there's only so much of that they can do. And it's why the Republicans are really in deep stuff, as it were.
What do you make of a man like Senator Bill Cassidy? On paper, very serious man. My understanding, he's a doctor, medical doctor.
Mm-hmm.
When he speaks, he comes off very serious. At the same time, he supported RFK Jr. while also disputing RFK Jr.'s acts. What happens to someone like him who loses the Republican primary, and now all of a sudden they find their voice after the fact because they don't fear? What is this story there with Senator?
The story there is that people who are scared, who want to hold their job, will try to walk that line, the one that I was describing before about Republican candidates in 2026. Bill Cassidy knew that he was up in 2026. He was trying to keep Trump happy enough without completely abandoning his principles as a doctor, with some power over health policy. And he tried to do it by obtaining promises from RFK that RFK then did not honor, by helping RFK Jr. become the HHS secretary. And he found that it didn't get him anything because Trump ended up taking him out. And now he, presumably embittered by that experience, he's going to express himself some. And he can make some difference over the next several months, but not a great deal. And it's a lose-lose situation for Republicans. There's a reason why people have created the phrase "everything Trump touches dies," and that's happened with Bill Cassidy and with Thomas Massey and some other Republican members.
So these guys they rolled the dice, and it seems like they rolled wrong. But that said, the people that are paying the consequences are the American people. Can you speak to that? You spoke a little bit about corruption before. Can you speak to the scale of corruption and really how that affects everyone?
I don't think we've ever had a president who was so passionately focused on making money in office. We've had corrupt presidents before. We've had acts of corruption. We had one president, Richard Nixon, forced to resign because of things he did in pursuit of the preservation of power. But I don't think we've seen anyone who was so strongly motivated by money and the desire to use his office for money. And I think people can see that that even if they don't fully appreciate the scale of the acts and how wrong they are, they can appreciate that he's not focused on them. And you make that clear not only with accepting an airplane and getting involved in crypto and other things that you have regulatory power over and can make money on, but doing things like destroying the East Wing of the White House, or talking about building some mammoth arch to disfigure the skyline of Washington, D.C., or trying to slap his name on the Kennedy Center, which was named by Congress, and now a federal judge has slapped that down and said they need to take the name off. People see this and they don't like it, and it's why his numbers are down across the board. Still has a MAGA constituency, but his share of approval in the country is getting closer and closer to the pure MAGA base, which is not enough to win an election.
Are you optimistic about the future of journalism? That's what I meant to say.
I am temperamentally an optimistic person. It is difficult to be optimistic at this moment because of the political challenges the country is facing. And even if we weren't facing those political challenges, the financial and existential challenges of retaining good journalism, it's difficult. And, I talk to young people often about prospects for entering the business, and God bless them. There are a lot of people who are very committed to this enterprise, but it's getting harder and harder to make a good living at it, to find a job in journalism. And it's becoming harder and harder to tell the truth as you see it. Now, you have some trends that offset that, things like the rise of Substack and independent news creators who can do things unfiltered. Very few people who are doing that are making a living at it, though. So that hopefully that will change over the long term, but that's at least one little green shoot that we can see.
John, what are you working on today? What are you working on in terms of reporting, in terms of working with what's going on behind the scenes in terms of politics. What are you seeing coming down the pike?
Well, I'm writing a column for Zateo, which is a digital magazine, and it's why I need to go in a couple minutes because I'm in the middle of writing that column. I'm doing Substack Live interviews for them. I'm doing some commentary on MS Now. And so that's a way that I am keeping my voice at this stage, latter stage of my career, keeping my voice alive in this process and hopefully exerting some positive influence. But again, it's an act of faith to be optimistic at this point, and I'm holding on the best as I can.
Let's sort of, if we can, maybe end on a more forward-looking note. What do you think would be an optimistic view of a future of journalism today, given AI, given the fragmentation, but even regardless of how much fragmentation is, people ingest so much information. There's clearly a demand for it. So there's clearly a mismatch, right, between people who are supplying the information, some of them far more credible than others, and people who are ingesting the information. What do you see as something that possibly, I know you talked about Substack, but really for journalists of the future, people who are in school now, people who are actively working even as they realize that prospects may not be positive, what are some things that maybe you can share for the next generation?
I will close with this note. That is the hope that, given the incredible fragmentation in terms of the dissemination of information we've seen in the country, that at some point, audiences in large numbers will find themselves craving places that can help them make sense of this sort of chaotic swirl of information. And that the result of that is the recreation of more places where journalism is practiced, not just on Substack, but in an aggregated way, so that you see a recreation of demand for shared fact sets. I'll close with this hope. The hope is that after this fragmentation of audience and information sources runs its course, that there is generated some widespread demand among viewers for large news organizations that can help them make sense of the world. It's very confusing, the information that flows at people every single day. And I think this is something that Substack is not necessarily equipped to do. It can help individual artists or creators or whatever you want to call them, writers, but it can't produce that sort of consensus or a shared reality, shared sense of facts. You have to hope that that is re-engendered in the country in a way that would support more large news organizations, because we have very few that really can make it effectively right now. And if that can happen, then I think we can have a revived journalism business that is able to hold the government accountable. And I think that will produce, in turn, better government, and we need it.
John, thank you so much for coming to the History of the President today, produced by The Intellectualist and Lincoln Square. We'd love to have you back on to discuss these issues of democracy again. So it was really great to have you here today.
My pleasure. Thanks.